against themselves, you know? So yeah, my name is Jim Surtees. I'm 70 years old, so I only work as a consultant now usually, although I have a film that's going to go into production this summer. And I consult. I'm the only consultant in the motion picture industry who can consult across the board, from acquiring and developing material all the way through distributing and marketing, everything in between, financing, production, pre-production, post-production, all of it. And that's because in order to make a living in this business today, you do a lot of different things. And I did a lot of different things. One, I was kind of a restless character. I started out as a television writer and became a writer-producer. Then I went on and became what they call a creative executive in the business. And I worked at Warner Brothers and Universal, finding and developing scripts that turned into television shows and movies. During that time, I worked for Clint Eastwood's company a number of times and developed 6 movies for Clint. Three summers ago, Paul Schrader, who was Martin Scorsese's original partner and wrote Taxi Driver and Raging Bull and a lot of other movies, went on to be a very successful director. And he and I made the first movie that was fully sourced from the internet. We raised the money on the internet. We were the first people to use the internet to raise the funding for a motion picture. We cast the movie on the internet using an international internet casting service, which, by the way, gave us casting choices that we would have never had we not done it that way. We found the crew through the internet, and we were making the movie to be an internet released production, but it actually got picked up for some commercial release, and it was named by New Yorker magazine as one of the top films of the year. It was a small, low-budget thriller, and it ended up becoming Lindsay Lohan's comeback picture, as it were. It was called The Canyons. I'm sure none of you saw it because your parents didn't let you. And so it was 2 old guys who went and did all this on the internet before anybody else. And we went for the same reasons. Paul and I have been friends for 45 years. And we're both guys who've always stayed at the cutting edge of what was going on in the business. The technology, the business models, the finance models, things like that. So I come from a family. I'm 3rd generation in the movie business from my family. It all started with my grandfather. My grandfather raised, bred, and raced thoroughbred horses out of Lexington, Kentucky, in the bluegrass country. And very early in his career, somebody ended up owing him a lot of money. And the guy didn't have the money. So instead of paying him with dollars, he gave him the title to a string of vaudeville theaters. Vaudeville was a type of entertainment. It was like variety shows that were done in live theaters all over the country. And they'd have comedians and dancers and people who did sketches and acrobats and just generally different forms of variety performance. And so my grandfather got these theaters in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky, and shortly after getting them, turned them all into Nickelodeons. And Nickelodeons was the American public's first look at moving pictures. And they were machined like this, with a screen here that you look down into. And you put a nickel into it, and you crank the handle. And it was a series of consecutive still photos on a drum. And as you crank the handle, of course, it caused movement from picture to picture to picture. And that's how the world, really, was introduced to moving images. There was no screen, there were no big movies yet. Those were yet to come. And when they started to come, my grandfather took these Nickelodeons and he changed them into movie theaters for the silent movies. And in the early days of the movies, all the films in America, most of the companies were in New York. And how they weren't big distribution companies like the big studios are today. They were these little companies that made movies, and they'd go out and they'd find guys that owned a few theaters, and they'd use those guys as their territorial distributors. And so my grandfather had set up this company because he didn't want to run the theaters, so he owned them. And that company became a territorial distributor for Fox Films, which was William C. Fox's film company in New York City. Well, my grandfather came out to the West Coast really early in the 20th century, around in the early 1900s, for the Kentucky Thoroughbred Racing and Owners and Breeders Association. And he came out here to introduce thoroughbred racing to the West Coast. And he was involved with setting up the first racetracks out here. Del Mar down in San Diego, Santa Anita, Golden Gate Park, Caliente in Mexico, eventually Hollywood Park in Hollywood. And while here, he realized, gee, this California is fabulous. And there were a few motion picture companies out here already working in what is now East Hollywood and Echo Park, Silver Lake area. That's where the very first studios were. And they were just small independent operators making silent films. So my grandfather went back to New York and he talked to Bill Fox. He said, you know, you got to move out there. The weather's great. It's always sunny. Light was a consideration, particularly in the early days of film. A lot of the studios, the sound stages, were open air. And because they needed the sunlight to shoot. And so Bill Fox came out here. My grandfather, being the hustler that he was, of course, was trying to sell Fox some land he owned out here. And Fox ended up not buying that land, but buying a small studio that already existed on Western Avenue in Los Angeles. And of course, years later, they moved from there out to what is now Century City. As a matter of fact, Century City is the entire of Century City is built on the old 20th Century Fox lot. Fox used to own all that, and it was all studio. And in those days, they shot on stages, and they shot on sets that were built on the studio property. So all that property you see that's Century City, even when I was a little boy in the 50s, they had, you know, a New York street and a town square, and World War II Europe, and, you know, Western Street. And they had all these things right on the studio lot. The studio went from Pico to Little Santa Monica, and from right behind Beverly Hills High School to what is Century Park West today. It's a huge, huge property. And I got to see that. I was pretty much raised on the 20th Century Fox and MGM lots when I was a kid. I was what they refer to as a studio brat. And I was raised with a lot of other studio brats, people who went on to become writers, directors, movie stars, so it was fun. It was a pretty interesting lifestyle, to say the least. So my grandfather, once Fox moved out here and it started rolling, he was a part owner and he was on the board of directors. He was never an active filmmaker. He was just an investor. His deal was horse racing. That's what he liked. That's what he was good at. But he was on the board of directors of 20th Century Fox and helped to make a lot of the decisions on the studio's future and how it moved forward and who ran it. He was there when they hired Darryl Zanuck, the fabled leader of 20th Century Fox, and one of the handful of people who really established the motion picture business in America. So that's where the connection to the movies all came from. My grandfather had two sons. He had my dad, who was 6 years older than my Uncle Bob. And my dad was a professional baseball player. And he was penciled in to become the starting center fielder. He went to spring training. He was going to be the starting center fielder for the Cincinnati Reds. This was in 1921. And he got hurt. And he never played baseball again. But he came out here. And he worked as a comedian in this vaudeville thing. For a few years, did stand-up comedy, and then he worked as a professional card dealer for the gambling boats. There used to be gambling boats back in those days that were out in the Catalina Channel between Long Beach and Catalina, out in the Pacific there. They had these boats. You couldn't gamble in the state, but you could go out on this boat and gamble. So they had these big, like, floating casinos out there. And my dad went out there and worked out there for a few years. And finally, my grandfather came to him and said, you know, Jim, you need a career. This is no career. He says, why don't you go to work at the studio? He said, the studio's really starting to happen, and I think this movie thing's going to stay with us. It's going to catch on and really go. And so my dad went to 20th Century Fox, and he started there as a driver, driving a truck around, and he ended up developing location departments for the studio. And the location manager, what a location manager does is he goes out usually with the director and the producer, and he finds all the locations they're going to use for the picture. He makes all the arrangements at those locations for the studio to use them. If it's out of state or out of country, he makes all the arrangements for permits and permissions. And then he comes back to the studio and he arranges all the transportation to get everything there while they're there and to get everything back. Well, they never had all that in one department until my dad came up with the idea. And he came up with the idea at 20th Century Fox, and Zanuck liked it and made him the head of that department, the location department. And they loaned him out to MGM, and he did the same thing for MGM, and then came back to Fox. I'm always proud of my dad. My dad was an interesting kid. They were from Kentucky, which is basically a southern state. But when my dad was a kid, he had spent some time playing against the old Negro League teams, and he developed a real attitude about how these men were being treated. Because he would tell you till the day he died that the two best baseball players he ever saw in his life were Josh Gibson, the old catcher from the Negro Leagues, who was never able to play in the big leagues, and Satchel Paige, a pitcher from the old Negro Leagues, who finally played in the big leagues when he was 50 years old. He started a game as a pitcher in the big leagues. And so my dad decided that if they were going to have this location department, one of the things they were going to do is they were going to have some African American location managers. And he hired them. And man, I mean, he ran into a world of people resisting that. And because he helped found the transportation union, the Teamsters union in the studios, and was on the board of the Teamsters, he went there and convinced the Teamsters that they had to hire African American individuals to be part of this union. It was an American union. And I've always been very proud of my dad for that. He was very involved in the American Civil Rights Movement. He was a friend of Dr. King's. Dr. King had dinner at our table once, and many of the guys who worked for him came to our house, and I'd see him. I was just a kid, you know. I didn't really know everything that was going on, but I'd see these guys at our dinner table, and later that week on television, I'd see them down in Montgomery, Alabama, getting sprayed by fire hoses or run over by dogs and policemen on horses, and I go, oh my God, that's, you know, so-and-so. And Sammy Davis was a great friend of our family, Sammy Davis Jr. And you know, they always talk about Sammy, and some people thought he was Uncle Tom in it a bit, and he did all those black accents and all that stuff. Let me tell you this story about Sammy Davis Jr. No matter where it was, when Martin Luther King got incarcerated and arrested, the first phone call was to Sammy Davis Jr., and that's what bailed him out of jail every time. So, just an aside, but I think an important aside about American history and about the role that the film industry has played in trying to find equality for people that are kind of under the gun right now because of the lack of, they're not hiring enough minorities, they're not hiring enough women. You know, why there aren't as many women directors as men, I don't know. The women directors are really fabulous. Catherine Bigelow, she can direct as well as any guy out there. And so, all this went on. My dad went on with his career and became, and there used to be a position in the studios called executive in charge of production, because the studio owned everything, they financed everything, they had all the actors, all the technicians, everybody under contract. It was like a sports organization in a way, in the way they owned everything. And so my dad was basically under contract to Fox, although they'd let him go and work other movies for MGM, just MGM, nobody else.